Hi and welcome back. It's the morning, so I have my coffee. Today we're going to be discussing intervals, but before I get started, you may notice a kind of loss of video quality here. I was using the Zoom HD camera, but the problem is, as much as I zoomed out, I had to sit very far away to get what you're seeing right now, this kind of zoom out. Which made me sit far from the camera, which has a built-in mic, and therefore it sounded like kind of muffled at the distance. So instead I'm using my USB mic and my webcam in order not to sacrifice audio. If there's a problem and you don't like the video quality, cool, I'll change back to it, and I could, in my editing software, I could bump up the audio. This just saved me one step, really. Okay, so today we're going to discuss intervals. Now, before we do, I have the little tag on the title, Fragments of Infinity, what they didn't teach you in music school. And you may say, well, gee, Vinny, I went to music school and they did teach me about the circle of fifths, and they did teach me about intervals and all that. Yes, they did, of course. These are elements of music that you cannot avoid. They exist in musical territory. What they didn't teach you is kind of a way of looking at, and that's kind of what I specialize in, is changing your perspective so perhaps you could get a different view and therefore more of an epiphany of, exactly how this is all working. So what is an interval? Intervals are basically measuring sticks between note X and note Y. Any two notes has a distance between it, and that's what you're measuring. All right. For our purposes, we can find all the different interval types within one octave of a diatonic scale, or the C major scale we'll use in our example. All right. Now, there are some confusing factors about intervals. And precisely, it's the way they're named, and this is one of the qualms I have with the language they teach in music school. It's we went through the whole idea of enharmonic phenomena, and there's three names for one thing. That's kind of problematic, Well, there's a little bit of confusion in this, and I want to clarify before we get started. But first we have to learn about the first interval type, which is called the second. All right, a second is an adjacent set of notes. So this is a second right here, E to F, F to G is a second, D to E is a second, A to B is a second. Now, but if you notice, if we categorize all these as seconds, this is a second, this is a second, this is a second, there are two different types of seconds, because why? Because if you remember the whole step, half step formula video, I taught you about that. There's a whole step between C and D, yes. There's a whole step between D and E, yes, but there's only a half step between E and F. So there are seconds, but we have to refine the type of second. Is it a large second, a whole step, or is it a small second, a half step? Okay. Well, here's where the confusion comes in. A half step is called a minor second, and a whole step is called a major second, okay? Here's where I have to clarify. I've taught this before, and students start relating the terms minor and major to chords. In the case here, think of major as large and minor as small. That's all you have to think of, but it's totally not related to chord naming or anything like that. Yes, you do find intervals within chords, but and you can name those intervals, but that has nothing to do with the chord name. So don't construe major and minor intervals with major and minor chords. There's no connection whatsoever, okay? All right, so we've already discovered that the space between two adjacent notes, if it's a whole step, it's called a major second, larger second, and the space between two adjacent notes that are half step are called a minor second. Now, we have to measure between what's called a third, and again, to find a third, you take your first note and count three steps, 1, 2, 3. So C to E is a third, or E, F, G. That's a third. G, A, B. So basically we're leapfrogging over a middle note. But we do go in sequence across the scale that way. All right, now, because of whole steps and half steps are throughout the scale, you're going to run into the same problem that you did with major and minor seconds. In other words, we're going to find major and minor thirds big thirds and small thirds. So if I go from C to E, 1, 2, 3, that's a third, and I want to measure the distance from C to E, we know it's 2 whole steps, all right? 2 whole steps is equivalent to what we call a major third, all right? Why major? Because if we look at D to F, we notice that we have whole step, half step. That's a smaller kind of third, so that's called the minor third, all right? This is called the major third, C to E. D to F would be called a minor third. E to G is a minor third. Why? Because we have the half step within. F to A is a major third, 2 whole steps. G to B is a major third, 2 whole steps. A to C is a minor third because it's a step and a half. Let me extend the scale here. Extending the scale into the next octaves because we might want to look at B to D. Now again, we have in B to D we have the half step there, so that is a minor third. And then we go back to the beginning, C to E is a major third. Okay, so now we have seconds and thirds. Before we continue, I'm going to talk about inverting intervals. That's flipping them over. In other words, I can go from C to E, and I can go from E to C, right? So, is there a connection? Absolutely there is. There's a sonic connection, a mathematical, and a mathematical connection. Let me demonstrate on guitar. Now, first of all, thirds tend to be sing-songy. You have this melody, and if you harmonize it in minor and major thirds, all right, now I have this sound G to B, right? Now I want to flip it, so in other words, I'm taking this B and leaving it, but I'm going to take this G and put it into the high octave over here. Notice how they sing together. This is very, very common, all right? People do it naturally. They sing in thirds to harmonize. So in the first situation, I had 1, 2, 3, major third. Then I had 1, 2, 3 of the scale, minor third. Then 1, 2, 3, and that's a minor third as well. Right? And again, if I flip it and play the same melody, I put the G up top now. Again, that sing-song equality, it rings together very nicely. That's the beauty of thirds, okay? So that's called an inverted interval, and we'll get to that in a second. There is a name for that inversion, and they can relate to each other, as you heard. They both sound sing-songy, all right? So now we have minor seconds, minor thirds, major thirds. Now we come to the category of fourths, and this is an odd puppy. 1, 2, 3, 4. C to F. Let's count the whole steps and half steps. Whole, half. 2.5 steps, all right? Let me try another fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4, D to G. 1.5, 2.5 steps again. Let me try E to A. A half, 1.5, 2.5, 2.5 steps again. Let's go F to G. Whole. 3 whole steps, that's different. Let's go to G. Whole and a half, 2.5 steps, G to C, that's a fourth. A, B, C, D, whole step, half step, whole step, 2.5, okay? So there, if I keep going, it'll be the same thing, like B to E is half, and then 2 whole, so 2.5. We have that one odd interval from F to B, all right? Very important interval, and it's different than the typical fourth, but we don't name fourths and fifths, as you're about to see, by minor and major intervals. The reason being that if I lower this F, like from C to F, if I lower that, calling it a minor fourth, that can't exist because it's already named as a major third, C to E. And if I raise the F to F sharp, I get that odd interval of 3 whole steps, which is an interval that stands on its own inside the scale. So C to F, D to G, E to A, not F to B, G to C, A to D, and B to E are all perfect fifths. They all count 2.5 steps, okay? Did I say fifths? I meant perfect fourths. I've been doing that a lot lately. All right, now before we go to that odd interval that's 3 whole steps, let's look at fifths now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, C to G. When you count 5, that means fifth, right? So we have 1, 2 and a half, 3.5 steps comprises what's called a perfect fifth. Now if we go up the scale, we're going to find a number of these perfect fifths. 1 and a half, 2 and a half, 3 and a half. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3.5 steps again. E to B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Half, whole, 3.5 steps. F to B is the odd interval. We'll skip that and come back to it right quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, G to B, G to D, 1, 2 and a half, 3.5 steps. So you see, the only odd interval is from, if I go B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now I'm going to get that weird interval again, and it's half, 1.5, 2.5, and I add another half here, I get 3 whole steps. Well, wait a second, I counted 5 for that one, and when I went F to B, when I flipped this interval, first it was F to B as a fourth, and I've got 1, 2, 3 whole steps. Then if I go B to F, I get half, whole, half. That's 3 whole steps again, distance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How can that be? I get the same distance when I flip the interval. Well, that's called the tritone interval. It is a fascinating interval, and in the classical days, the ancient classical days, the church referred to that interval as the devil's interval, which I think is really funny because actually it's a really, really useful, amazing interval that does all sorts of wild stuff. It's a component of the dominant 7th chord, is inside that, and that's what gives the dominant 7th its character. If you want to hear the sound of that particular interval, if I go F to B, or if I go B to F, you might recall Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze starts off with that's tritone intervals right there. He wanted to get a really obtuse sound, and he got it with that tritone interval. Now, tritone interval, why is it called a tritone? Because it's 3 whole steps, 1, 2, 3. And again, this is the only place in this scale we'll find, all right, you can, all right, geez, I have to explain this. There is another kind of fourth besides a perfect fourth, and that is the augmented fourth. In other words, augmented means made larger, okay? So if we look at F to B, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. The other fourths were 2.5 steps, not 3 steps. So this is a larger kind of fourth. And when we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, B to F, when we invert that interval, we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's called a diminished fifth. And why? Because the distance between B to F is half, whole, half, which is 3 whole steps. But the perfect fifth is 3.5 steps. So this is slightly smaller, so diminished fifth. When you raise a fourth into this interval, it becomes an augmented fourth. When you lower a fifth into this interval, it becomes a diminished fifth. Same sound, all right? Now, we talked about inverted intervals. Now we start reaching that territory. Once we get past the tritone interval, you can start to do inversions. So in other words, we had C to E. We had, let's start with the fourth. We had C to F. All right, I can invert that interval by going F to C. And what happens is that becomes a perfect fifth. A whole, and a half. A whole, and a half, 3.5. So that is a perfect fifth. So when you invert a perfect fourth, it becomes a perfect fifth. All right. Now let's look at the thirds. We have C to E. If I go E to C, right, I get what's called a minor 6. Half, whole half. So that's half, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4. 4 whole steps. 4 whole steps will give you E to C, and that's called a minor sixth. Now, when we had the C to E, it was a major third, and now we have a minor sixth. That's what happens to these major minor intervals. When you flip them over, they become the opposite. I don't know what word to use, but they become the opposite of, if it's minor, it becomes major. If it's major, it becomes minor when you flip it. Okay. So so that's a minor sixth, and again, E to C, I want to count that. Half, 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4 whole steps. That's a minor sixth. So there must be a major sixth somewhere, and indeed there is. Let's think of E to G, right? So we have half, whole, 1.5 steps, and then we would go G to E, whole, half, whole. 1, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5. All right, so the minor sixth was 4, the major sixth is 4.5. All right, and then finally, when we flip seconds, we get C to D is a major second. So when we flip it, I already told you we're going to get a minor something, right? So we go up to C and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is a minor seventh interval, which means there must be a major seventh interval, and indeed there is. C to B. Well, first let's count the whole steps and half steps in this. 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5 steps to get the minor seventh. And the major seventh is probably going to be 5.5 steps because of that half step interval. So let's look at that. We have C to B, 1, 2, 3, 4, B to C. If we flip that, we'll put the C down here, and we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6 steps. All right. Now, so that's basically the intervals. I want to express something here, that there are the seconds and the sevenths are kind of in an outside category in the sense that they're not harmonized intervals. And what I mean by that is, let's take now we haven't got into chord building or anything like that, but I'm going to tell you the 3 notes that comprise a C major chord are C, E, and G. So if we look at C to E, C, D, E, we get a major third right there. And E to G, we get a minor third. E, F, G, minor third. So you could even say the formula for any major chord is major third plus minor third, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an inversion of this chord, which simply means I'm going to put these in different orders. So now I'm going to go E, G, C. Now the distance between E and G is 1.5 steps. That's called a minor third, 1, 2, 3. And then we go G up to C, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that's a perfect fourth, okay? So we get minor third, perfect fourth. And if we looked at C to E again, we'd get a major third. That's in this scenario here. Now I'm going to invert the chord one more time. Oh, and by the way, too, the outside interval on this chord is a perfect fifth, okay? The outside interval on this one is a minor sixth. If we count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we get a minor sixth interval. Why is it minor? Well, again, there are 2 types, and we measure the whole steps and half steps to compare the 2. All right, now I'm going to do one more inversion, and that's G, C, E. And I don't want to go through the details of counting and all that stuff, so I'm just going to tell you G to C is a perfect fourth, C to E is a major third, and we measure the outside interval, we get a major sixth. Now notice in all of these, we never ran into a seventh or a second, okay? So sevenths and seconds don't have a really sing-song equality. If we look at perfect fifths and perfect fourths and how they sing together, we get this sound. All right, this is what's known as the power chord, and they use it in hard rock and metal. All right. Now you notice, but let's go back in time. The first power chords were actually done in the old Gregorian days. It's called Gregorian chant. You may remember, if you've heard Gregorian chant, it's kind of very empty sounding music, very hollow. That's what perfect fifths sound like. Perfect fourths. Again, well, a fourth is a flipped fifth. So they're basically the same interval. They're going to have the same quality of hollowness. But then when we hear thirds and sixths, they sing together. Maybe I'll take that up an octave so you can hear the sing-song equality. Right? And if I flip those thirds into sixths, all right, so that's sing-song equality. Now let's listen to seconds. All right. Sorry. Not too harmonious, right? And if we flip that interval, A to G, yeah. Again, not too harmonious. So these seconds and sevenths don't have that sing-song equality. They don't figure into any triads, okay? We start to get that interval when we go beyond the major and minor chord to the dominant seventh chord. Then we do start to see a seventh in there, interval. And that's not why it's called a seventh chord, all right? I mean, there's a confusion with all this. So separate intervals from chords themselves. What I was showing you with the chords was the actual intervallic distances between notes within the chord. And we've seen that there's an eliminated note. All right, now I want to get to that odd interval called the tritone. It stands on its own. There is no other tritone. When you flip it, it's still a tritone, okay? Unlike the other intervals. The distance is always the same. I might give it a different name, like from F to B as opposed to B to F. Notice 1, 2, 3, 4 steps there, F to B, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps over there. And in this case, it's called an augmented fourth, and in this case, it's called a diminished fifth. This one is slightly larger than a fourth. This one is slightly smaller than a fifth. However, you notice when you invert the other intervals, there are different whole steps and half steps. Like a major third has 2 whole steps, and when you flip it, you get your 6, and you get the series of whole steps and half steps. This is the only interval, which makes it magical for a number of reasons, even sonically, when you use it sonically in chords. This is a magic interval because it's 3 whole steps this way, and even though we see half steps in here, if we count everything, half, 1 1/2, 2 1/2, and then another half equals 3. That's 3 whole steps. So, same exact sound whether you flip it or not, okay? It's the same exact interval. Now, the interesting thing is, although the church called this the devil's interval, I know what the real devil's interval is, and I'll teach that to you in the future when we get into chord extension and building chords and stuff like that. But, all right, so really interesting thing. When I was young, when I was in my teens, I was interested in a lot of kind of out-of-the-box subjects, areas of study, and I got really into mysticism. I bought a lot of books on spirituality from different cultures and esoteric literature and all that stuff, and I became really fascinated by it. Well, this one book was talking about the notes of the chromatic scale, actually, right? I'm not going to write them down, but we have the C note. Notice there are 12 notes, and guess what? There are 12 astrological signs. Actually, I do have to write out the chromatic scale for this. Let me write it out for you. All right, so what they said was that each of the 12 notes corresponds to an astrological sign, which is kind of wild. And I'm going to show you that series because when we get to that all-important tritone interval, something interesting happens. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, here's my chromatic series. And notice that I call it a series and not a scale. I don't believe the chromatic scale is a scale. It's a genetic pool from which we can make scales and chords and all that stuff. Now, this note, C, was dedicated to Aries. And now Aries, like if you study astrology at all, Aries they call the kind of springtime astrological sign. It's kind of youthful and young. In astrology, the new year begins in March. That's their old tradition. So this is the beginning right here, C. D flat relates to Taurus, I think it is. I forget D. I think D might be Gemini. E flat. No, E is Gemini. E flat is Leo. I forget what comes after Taurus, if you guys know. All right, so we get to F is Virgo. That's me, I'm a Virgo. And you can see by how detailed I am with stuff. And then we get to G flat or F sharp, and harmonically. That is Libra, okay? We could go on Scorpio, blah, 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 blah. But I wanted to get to this Libra one because if I put a C at the end here, thus tying up the entire octave of 13 notes, right? If I look at this G flat, all right, it stands dead center between C and C of the chromatic series, okay? And you'll know from seeing even in your daily papers, they have the astrology reports. Do people read papers anymore? I don't think so. But anyway, the symbol for a Libra is the scale. And it's the idea of the balance, right? And here we have a note right in the center of the chromatic scale that's splitting it into equal halves. So I find that phenomenon and that connection kind of interesting. I know that, again, I've spoken about the Greeks and how they synergized their sciences and their mysticism and felt they were all related. So that is that for that. So this is intervals. I'm wondering if there's anything else I should be talking to you about regarding these. And I don't think there are. So yeah, you could go onto any internet website about music and look up intervals and you get a chart. A good chart would be just by naming the whole steps and half steps. In other words, half step equals minor second, whole step equals major second, 1.5 steps equals minor third, 2 whole steps equals major third, so on and so forth. Okay, if you were my student, I'd be writing this all down on paper for you and leaving it with you. So that's that on intervals. It's a necessary step. We're still on the basics, and we have one more, and I just want to do a kind of wide overview of the 3 systems because this is where we start climbing Everest, and after this overview, we'll be at base camp, so get your gear ready, get your oxygen ready, your food supplies and water supplies, and your tents and your backpacks, and get ready to climb. The reason I want to do an overview of the 3 systems before we actually get into them specifically and drill down into each is that is precisely that. I'm going to be hitting each of those areas. I want you to be prepared beforehand to know that I will be talking about not one music theory system, but 3. Okay? And so that's that for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I try not to make these boring, but I don't know how I'm going to do it unless I work up a good tap dance routine to bring into it, which you don't want to see me do that, trust me. There are 2 things you don't want to see me do. One is sing, and one is tap dance. Okay, well have a good night or day or whatever it is where you are, and talk to you soon.